Well, welcome to the 700 Club. The Supreme Court heard a landmark case yesterday concerning transgender medicine and children. Justices considered arguments on a Tennessee law that forbids certain medical treatments for minors.
The outcome of this case could have major implications for parents and children across the country. Tara Mergener reports from the Supreme Court.
Tennessee is one of 26 states blocking some kind of gender-affirming care for children. The ruling in this case could have implications across the country. An emotional day outside the Supreme Court, a line of fences separating protesters on both sides of the debate.
This case is all about protecting children. It's about protecting children from the kind of evil that everybody in the world has recognized as evil.
The plaintiffs in U.S. v. Skermeti argue Tennessee's law banning certain gender-affirming care for minors violates the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment because of sex-based discrimination.
It's not very comfortable being trapped in, because it just doesn't feel like you.
In contrast, Tennessee lawmakers who passed the law argue that it's necessary to protect children from potential long-term harm of irreversible medical treatments.
In Tennessee, we think this is a risky procedure.
Wednesday's oral arguments mark the first time the High Court has directly considered a state law regarding transgender people.
This case is about access to medications that have been safely prescribed for decades to treat many conditions, including gender dysphoria.
However, those in favor of Tennessee's law argue that caution is needed in light of documented cases of regret among some youth who have transitioned, raising questions about medical risks of those treatments for minors.
These interventions carry often irreversible and life-altering consequences, and the systematic reviews conducted by European health authorities have found no established benefits.
The justices seemed divided on these points, with the liberal justices pressing Tennessee's attorney on the potential harm of such laws.
One of the articulated purposes of this law is essentially to encourage gender conformity and to discourage anything other than gender conformity. And I'm wondering how you think that plays into the analysis.
Conservative justices framed the issue differently.
At a big picture level, I think the argument on the other side, putting aside some of the details, is why not trust parents rather than the state, particularly in a situation, as General Prelogger said, where there's not the kind of direct harm to third parties that you might see in other contexts like sports.
Yes, Your Honor. So, as my friends recognize, the parental rights question is not before this court.
Conservative Justice Clarence Thomas argued the law wasn't an outright ban, but rather focused on the age of the patients seeking treatment.
So why isn't this simply a case of age classification when it comes to these treatments, as opposed to a ban, as you suggested in your opening statement?
Chief Justice Roberts questioned whether the court is the best body to make decisions on evolving medical issues. The ruling will, of course, be watched closely by both sides and is expected by June. At the Supreme Court, I'm Tara Mergener, CBN News.
Well, we'll keep you posted on this. My view of it is there are certain rights in the Constitution that are reserved to the states, and the Supreme Court should give deference to that. If a state legislature has passed legislation that they claim is protecting young people, well, then the federal government, and particularly the Supreme Court, should give deference to that. We're seeing again and again in the sort of the medical view of this. Great Britain has come out and said that it can actually damage, that it doesn't really help the depression or suicide rates. In some instances, it can actually increase it. We're now seeing lawsuits filed by minors who have gone through transition surgery, and they're now saying, I didn't know what I was doing. I was talked into this, and now I really regret it. So why shouldn't we have protections, if state legislatures want that, protections for minors, that these procedures cannot be done on them until they reach an age where they can make independent decisions? As a culture, as a society, we've decided that age is 18. And so why not observe that and say it's perfectly fine for states to do that? In other news, Australia's new law protecting children online is putting pressure on U.S. lawmakers to pass their own version. Gary Lane has that story and more from the CBN Newsroom. Gary?
Gordon, Australia's law bans social media for children under age 16, the first time any nation has taken such a step. Now U.S. senators are calling on their colleagues in the House to take up a measure they passed over the summer. Lori Johnson reports.
Politicians in the U.S. and around the world tend to agree our children and teens need to be protected from the dangers of social media. However, lawmakers disagree about the best way to do that. Senate leaders on both sides of the aisle are urging the House to pass the Kids Online Safety Act before their Christmas vacation. Earlier this year, it breezed through the Senate 91-3.
These bills will provide the appropriate guardrails necessary to protect kids against online threats.
The measure calls for tech companies to program default settings to their highest security level, filter out posts that could lead to online harassment, and dismantle dangerous algorithms.
We've heard stories about kids who were going through a depressed episode, and all of a sudden they were getting fed content that was encouraging them to take their own lives.
Social media use among children and teens is linked to eating disorders, low self-esteem, sleep disturbances, and more.
I think most children will start walking away from their faith when they get their smartphones and they get social media, because it's teaching them such a different worldview of different than the Bible.
Under the proposed measure, kids would still be allowed to use social media. That's different from the just-passed Australian law, which imposes an outright ban for those under 16. It was backed by parents like Wayne Holdsworth, whose son committed suicide after a man pretending to be a girl convinced him to share intimate pictures and then threatened to post them online if he didn't give him money.
Anyone that says that this is not a good idea has not lived through my life, nor the hundreds of mums and dads that I've met in the last 8 months that have had their kids extorted and taken their lives as well.
Critics of the Australian law, however, say kids can easily break it.
With no digital ID, according to the government last night, unless you're doing facial recognition, I really struggle to see how this could be enforced with anything more than checking a box to say you're over a certain age, which is basically what we have now.
Meanwhile, the UK is considering a similar ban, backed by parents like Stuart Stevens, whose son Ollie was murdered after a dispute on social media.
I can't show you any of the stuff that we saw on his phone, but it's horrific. And a lot of that stuff you can't unsee, and especially as a child.
The ACLU says the Kids Online Safety Act violates the First Amendment by censoring free speech. Social media companies say kids have a right to access information on their platforms, which they say in many cases is beneficial. Lori Johnson, CBN News.
Thank you, Lori. A Chinese hacking campaign potentially gained access to data on hundreds of thousands of cell phone users in America. Officials believe at least 8 telecom companies were compromised. Senator Mark Warner, vice chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee, calling it the worst telecom hack in U.S. history. The Chinese government grabbing data, including the location of phone users, who they spoke with, and when. Even targeting a small group of senior government officials, in some cases able to read text messages and listen to conversations. The FBI is telling consumers to use encrypted apps, including for text messages and voicemail. Well, turning now to Israel, the Iranian-backed Hezbollah is set on rebuilding as a military force to resume its fight against the Jewish state. Meanwhile, in Gaza, an isolated Hamas could be ready to make a hostage deal. Paul Strand has the story from Jerusalem.
U.S. intelligence says Hezbollah is recruiting more fighters and looking for more weapons. Reports indicate the terror group aims to rebuild and continue its fight far into the future, despite Israel destroying more than half its weapons and killing thousands of its fighters. The ceasefire specifically forbids the terror group from rearming, a main concern for Israel in the negotiations. As for Hamas in Gaza, Israel's defense minister says the IDF's degradation of Hezbollah and successful strikes against Iran have isolated the terror group, increasing the odds it will do a hostage deal.
Both the places of deterrence of Iran and what's happening in Lebanon, and in all places, the intensity of the pressure of this monstrous organization called Hamas is increasing, and there's a chance that this time we will really be able to advance a hostage deal.
The Israeli government reportedly has submitted a new ceasefire proposal. Meanwhile, President-elect Trump, who is said to want a deal before he takes office, has appointed Adam Boehler, one of the negotiators of the Abraham Accords, as a special envoy for hostage affairs. The IDF says it's recovered the body of another hostage, Itai Svirsky.
Itai was kidnapped from his parents' home in Kibbutz Be'eri on October 7th. His parents were murdered by Hamas terrorists. Itai was kidnapped alive. In January, we announced he was murdered, and together with him, Yossi Sharabi was killed.
In the U.S. Capitol, New York lawmakers honored Omer Nutra. The native New Yorker was an Israeli-American serving in the IDF who was captured on October 7th and now determined to have been killed that day.
Omer, serving as a tank commander, was among the first to respond to Hamas's brutal attack, risking his life to protect others. Tragically, as we learned this weekend, his life was taken during this horrific massacre.
And on this day of pure evil, Omer Nutra lost his life commanding his tank platoon in defense of Israel against these barbaric Hamas terrorists.
I now ask that all members join me for a brief moment of silence in honor of Omer Nutra.
Paul Strand, CBN News, Jerusalem.
Gordon Hayes, a Israeli delegation is on its way to Cairo for negotiations, and they're hoping that Donald Trump's warning against Hamas will make a difference this time.
We'll see. I have every hope that it will, because we need to stand strong against this. But I'll have a point of caution. We're already seeing with Hezbollah with the ceasefire. In their ideology, they want to wipe Israel out. That's what they have proclaimed that they want to do, and they're quite upfront with their intention. They also pledge allegiance to the Ayatollah. So they're essentially an Iranian proxy and a shadow government within a larger government of Lebanon. And they're also a political party. Hamas is a political party, and they're an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood. They also have vowed to wipe out the Jewish state. Their entire thing is creating a totally Palestinian state in place of Israel, and that means genocide. It means wiping out every single Jew living in Israel. So let's recognize what they're saying and believe them. These are in their founding documents. It's not like they've hid it. They've put it out there for the entire world to see. If there's a ceasefire, if they release the hostages, is it just giving them an opportunity to reload? Hezbollah right now is reloading, and their ideology hasn't changed. They haven't somehow come to the realization that it's a good idea to have Israel in the Middle East. They haven't come to that. Hamas isn't coming to that. And so are we just sort of playing this game of let's kick the can down the road? At some point in time, the entire world needs to stand up and say, no, this ideology is wrong at its core. You don't have the ability to do this, and not on our watch. We vowed after the Holocaust that we will never forget. We will remember, and we vowed never again. In our generation, right now, it's happening. The anti-Semitism rising around the world, the let's wipe Israel off the map, to hear on the streets of America, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. And for people not to understand, that means killing every single Jew in Israel. No, this cannot happen in our generation. We need to stand firm, and we need to stand until this ideology is completely removed.